Most people who look at Buckingham Palace see the balcony, the gold, the changing of the guard. They see a house built for kings and queens. But the palace the world admires was never really run by the people whose names it carries. Behind the staterooms, below the marble, a second palace existed. Hundreds of men and women lived and worked in its basements and attics, along corridors the public never saw, on wages a fraction of the value of a single object they polished. They were trained to vanish. To be seen was to fail. This is the story of the hidden army that kept the most famous house on earth alive, and of everything that invisible service truly cost the people who gave it. If you love the stories that grand houses keep hidden below the surface, take a moment to subscribe. There is a whole world beneath the marble, and you will not want to miss where this one leads. Chapter 1. A palace that could not keep itself warm. When Victoria moved in during the summer of 1837, she took possession of the most famous address in Britain and one of the worst run. She was 18 years old. She was also the first monarch ever to live in Buckingham Palace, and the building she inherited was not finished. Her predecessor, King William IV, had died before the work was complete. The young queen walked into a house that looked like a palace and behaved like a building site. The state rooms were magnificent. Gilded, mirrored, hung with paintings, they were made to stun ambassadors and silence rivals. Everywhere else, the palace failed. The ventilation was so poor, and the interior smelled so bad, that gas lamps had to be fitted, which then raised a new fear that the gas would gather in the lower rooms and one day catch. The chimneys smoked so badly that fires had to be kept low. A house meant to warm a monarch could not warm itself. It stood cold and half-lit through its first royal winters, grand to the eye and grim to the body. Picture it as the servants first knew it. Cold air moving through unfinished passages. The sour smell that the gas lamps had been brought in to mask. Smoke curling back down the chimneys into rooms that were supposed to glow with comfort. The grandest house in the kingdom was, in its early years under Victoria, a place of draughts and shadows and the constant labour of trying to make it livable. And that labour fell, every hour of every day, on people the public never saw. The palace had grown out of a private house. King George III had bought Buckingham House in 1761. It was his son, King George IV, who dreamed of turning it into a palace, and he employed the architect John Nash to do it, at enormous and controversial expense. The work dragged on. George IV died in 1830 with the palace still unfinished. William IV died in 1837 with it unfinished still. And so Victoria took possession of a shell of splendour wrapped around a house that did not yet function, a monument to royal ambition that could not warm a single room. The servants inherited the gap between the dream and the reality, and it was their labour, day after day, that filled it. Behind that grandeur lived a second palace that almost no visitor ever saw. It was a settlement of working people, built into the fabric of the building itself. Look at the rooms, and the scale of it appears. The palace holds 775 of them. Of those, 188 are staff bedrooms, 92 are offices, 78 are bathrooms, 52 are principal and guest bedrooms. Only 19 are staterooms. The numbers tell a truth the public face hides. Far more of the palace was made for servants than for sovereigns. A very large part of the palace itself was, and still is, a place for working people to sleep. Those working people were the reason the building functioned at all. A palace of this size could not clean itself, feed itself, or light itself. Every cold grate had to be cleared and laid. Every lamp had to be trimmed and filled. Every corridor, and there were miles of them, had to be swept. Every meal for a household of hundreds had to be cooked in basement kitchens and carried up through hidden passages. The splendor the world admired was a daily act of labor, performed over and over by people the world was not meant to notice. Warmth was carried in as coal, light was carried in as oil, cleanliness was scrubbed into the stone by hand. Nothing in the palace happened by itself. They moved through their own version of the palace. Great houses of this era were designed around a single principle: the servants should be unseen. They used their own stairs, their own passages, their own doors, so that the family and its guests would never meet the labor that surrounded them. The 188 staff bedrooms and the network of service corridors lay at the very heart of the design. The palace was built to keep two worlds under one roof, side by side, and to keep them apart. A guest could cross a stateroom in perfect comfort and never know that a few feet away, behind a concealed door, a servant was climbing a narrow stair with a scuttle of coal. Across the wider royal household, the numbers ran into the hundreds and beyond. The household historically employed more than 1,000 domestic servants across all the royal residences. The three great departments that ran it could reach up to 900 staff in one, up to 350 in another, and up to 170 in a third. Even today, when machines have replaced whole armies of hands, the palace remains the workplace of more than 800 people. In Victoria's time, without those machines, the human cost of keeping the house alive was greater still. Every task the modern age hands to a switch or a motor was then handed to a person. So who were they, these hundreds of invisible people who cooked and cleaned and carried in the cold and the smoke? How did a house this large, this troubled, this badly built, get run at all? The answer, in Victoria's first years, was that it was barely run. The palace had 3 masters below stairs where it needed one, and the war between them left rooms unswept and fires unlit for reasons no ordinary servant could ever fix. Chapter 2: The House That Answered to 3 Masters. Before anyone could clean a room or light a fire, they had to know which of 3 great lords the task belonged to. This was the strange, tangled system that governed the palace when Victoria arrived. The running of the household was split between 3 court officers of enormous rank and almost no presence. Each was a political appointee. Each changed when the government changed, and each rarely set foot in the place he was supposed to command. They were grand names on a list rather than masters in a house. The first was the Lord Chamberlain. His department was responsible for the rooms, the furnishings, and most of the indoor servants. Historically, it was the largest of the 3, a body that could swell to as many as 900 people. The second was the Lord Steward. His department handled provisioning, the kitchens, and the fuel, a force of up to 350. The third was the Master of the Horse, who ran the royal mews and the stables, with up to 170 under him. 3 lords, 3 armies of servants, and no single person in charge of the whole. It was less a household than 3 households pretending to be one. The result was chaos, and the chaos had a shape. Because every task belonged to a department, and no department owned the whole, work fell into the cracks between them. The most famous example survives to this day, quoted by the Royal Collection Trust from the Royal Archives. A fire in a cold room might go unlit, and the explanation given was that, properly speaking, it was not the servant's fault, for the Lord Steward laid the fire only, and the Lord Chamberlain lit it. One department was permitted to lay the wood. A different department was permitted to put the match to it. If the 2 did not act together, the room simply stayed cold, and no servant on the spot had the power to fix it. Hold that fire in your mind, because it is the whole broken system in miniature. A servant stands in a freezing room. The wood is laid in the grate, ready, and she cannot light it, because lighting it belongs to another department, another chain of command, another lord who is not there. The cold had nothing to do with laziness or shortage. A boundary drawn on paper between men who never visited was enough to keep a room freezing. The Royal Collection Trust describes the old structure plainly. 3 departments with unclear responsibilities, whose divisions created inefficiency. That dry phrase, divisions created inefficiency, meant, in daily life, cold rooms and idle hands and work that no one was allowed to do. And in the absence of any single master in the house, discipline dissolved. It was said that the male and female servants, having no master over them, came and went as they pleased. A palace that could not agree on who lit its fires could hardly govern the comings and goings of its staff. Without one authority to answer to, the servants slipped through the gaps in the system, and the great house ran loose and slack, its enormous workforce ungoverned at the very top. The waste ran deep, and it ran in every direction. Money leaked from a household where no single officer was accountable for the whole. Food, fuel, candles, and supplies flowed through departments that did not answer to one another, and much of it was lost, spoiled, or quietly taken along the way. Posts existed that paid a salary for almost no work, protected by custom and by the fact that no one had the authority to abolish them. The 3 great lords who nominally ruled the household were creatures of politics, appointed and removed as governments rose and fell, and none of them stayed long enough or cared enough to master the machine beneath them. The palace was, in effect, 3 overlapping kingdoms sharing one roof, each guarding its own borders, none responsible for the whole. And the servants, caught between those borders, learned early that competence counted for less than knowing whose permission a task required. Later writers made this chaos vivid, and the most colourful stories must be handled with care. It has been told for more than a century that the inside of a window was cleaned by one department and the outside by another, so the glass stayed dirty forever. It has been told that rooms went unswept because no one owned the broom. These particular elaborations were made famous by the writer Lytton Strachey in his book on Queen Victoria, published in 1921, and he in turn drew on the memoirs of the diarist Charles Greville and the papers of Baron Stockmar. They are wonderful illustrations of a real problem, but they are literary retellings, repeated as fact ever since, rather than incidents proven in a household ledger. The honest way to tell them is as the famous account of the palace's disorder, not as a receipt. Yet the underlying failure was entirely real, and the servants lived inside it every day. Imagine the position of an ordinary housemaid. She could see a cold grate. She could see the dust. She could see exactly what needed doing. But whether she was permitted to do it might depend on a boundary drawn between 3 lords she would never meet, men who came and went with the tides of Westminster politics. Her competence counted for nothing against the system, and the system was built to fail. A capable, willing worker could be rendered useless by a division of duties drawn up by men she had never seen. For the palace itself, the price was constant. Cold rooms, smoking fires. A building that its own machinery of servants could not properly maintain, because no one had drawn a clear line of command through them, however willing those servants were. The most powerful monarchy in the world lived in a house run like a squabbling committee. It was an embarrassment that could not last. And the person who would end it was a young foreign prince, newly arrived, who had married the queen and found her palace intolerable. Chapter 3. The Prince Who Seized the Household. It took a foreign prince and a quiet German baron to look at the chaos of the palace and decide to end it. The prince was Albert, Victoria's husband. The baron was Christian Friedrich von Stockmar, a physician turned advisor who had followed the couple's fortunes for years and who understood, better than almost anyone, how a court could rot from the inside. Between them, they did what three great lords had never managed. They took hold of the household and forced it to obey a single hand. Albert found the disorder of the palace intolerable, and his objection went far beyond comfort. It was money, and it was decency. A household split between three absent lords bled waste from every seam. Sinecures, posts that paid a salary for little or no work, clung to the establishment like barnacles. Duties overlapped, so that some tasks were done twice and others not at all. To a prince who counted every pound and believed in order as a kind of virtue, the palace was a scandal dressed in gold. He looked at the cold rooms and the loose discipline and saw bad design where others saw mere bad luck, and bad design was a thing a determined man could fix. Stockmar set the reform in motion with paper. He wrote a memorandum on the present state of the royal household and a second memorandum on how to reform it. Both survive in the royal archives, the quiet documents behind a loud change. They laid out the problem exactly as the servants lived it: a house with no master, duties with no owner, money with no guard. To read them was to see the whole tangled failure set down in order, and once a problem is written down clearly, it can be attacked. Acting on them, Albert carried through a thorough reorganization of the household. Reference works date the main reform to around 1844. It achieved great economies. It abolished sinecures and other abuses. And it ended the overlapping duties that had left the fires unlit and the windows dirty. The heart of the change was a single office. The master of the household had existed since the 16th century and had been re-established in 1805, but it had decayed into a sinecure, a grand title attached to little real power. Albert took that hollow office and filled it. Under the reform, the master of the household was given charge of the entire domestic establishment. For the first time, one person stood at the top of the below-stairs world, and every servant, down to the lowest housemaid, answered up a single clear chain of command. The fire could now be laid and lit by people who reported, in the end, to the same master. The boundary that had kept a room cold was simply erased. For the servants, this was a quiet revolution in daily life. The housemaid, who had once been trapped by the boundary between three lords, now had a line of authority she could actually follow. Work that fell into the cracks now had an owner. Discipline, so long absent, returned, because at last there was someone with the power to enforce it. The palace became governable at last, though it grew no gentler and no more generous for it. A machine that had rattled and stalled for want of a driver finally had one. In the 1920s, the old Lord Steward's Department would even be formally renamed the Master of the Households Department, the last echo of Albert's victory long after he was gone. Albert's changes brought order and economy to the workforce, aimed at thrift and control rather than the comfort of the workers. The same rules of invisibility remained. The same low wages remained. The same punishing hours remained. What changed was that the vast labour of the palace was now organised, counted, and controlled. Albert had perfected the system that used the servants, drawing every scattered task and every idle hand into one tight, answerable structure, and their freedom was never any part of his purpose. A well-run machine is still a machine, and the people inside it were still its moving parts. There is a hard truth in this that the servants themselves may have felt. order can be a comfort and a cage at once. Under the old chaos, a servant suffered cold rooms and confusion, but the very looseness of the system left cracks a person could live in, hours that went unwatched, a master who was never there. Albert's reform closed those cracks. Every task now had an owner, every hour an account, every servant a place in a chain that reached up to a single controlling hand. The palace became warmer, cleaner, and better run, and it also became a tighter, more watchful, more demanding place to serve. The servants gained a functioning house and lost the small freedoms that disorder had accidentally allowed them. The reform reached beyond management into the very stones of the palace. As the household grew, so did the building. By 1847, Victoria and Albert had decided that the palace was too small for court life and for their growing family. The architect, Edward Blore, was set to design a new east front, the wing that now faces the mall and carries the famous balcony, and it was raised by the master builder, Thomas Cubitt. The palace expanded outward to hold a larger court and a larger household, and every new room and corridor added to the burden the servants carried. A bigger palace meant more grates to clear, more lamps to trim, more floors to scrub, more meals to cook and carry. The grander the house became, the heavier the invisible labour that held it up. Through the middle decades of the century and into the reign that followed, the ordered household reached its height. The machine hummed, the fires were laid and lit, the dinners rose from the basements on time, the corridors were swept by hands that knew exactly whose orders they followed. To the world at the railings, the palace at last looked effortless. Ambassadors came and went through warm, gleaming rooms. Guests dined beneath blazing chandeliers and never guessed at the labour behind the glow. That effortlessness was the great illusion, and it was manufactured every day by people who had just been taught, more firmly than ever, exactly how to disappear. Chapter 4. The Rule That Made Them Vanish. The first thing a new servant learned inside the palace was how to disappear, long before she had mastered the work itself. The work could be taught in weeks. The disappearing had to become instinct. A footman, a maid, a hall boy, a porter, all of them lived under one law that governed every hour of the day. They were not to be seen. The people who kept the palace running were expected to move through it like ghosts, present everywhere, visible nowhere, and the training began the moment they arrived. A servant learned the back stairs before she learned anything else, because the back stairs were where she belonged. The rule went far beyond manners. It was precise and physical. Domestic servants were expected to remain invisible to royalty, and the surviving description of what that meant is blunt. They were to leap into a cupboard if they heard Her Majesty coming. A housemaid, caught in a corridor as the Queen approached, knew exactly what was required of her. She hid. She stepped into a doorway, a recess, a cupboard, anywhere that would remove her from the royal eye. To be seen was to fail at the one thing the palace most demanded, and a servant who could not vanish was a servant who would not last. Imagine training your own body to flinch away from the sight of the person you served, day after day, until it became as natural as breathing. This is the truth beneath the beauty, and it can be said in a single line that will return before this story ends. A palace remembers its kings. It forgets the hands that kept it standing. The forgetting was deliberate, designed into the very architecture. The back stairs, the service passages, the servants' own doors, all of them existed so that the labour of the house could be erased from the experience of the house. The people who made the grandeur possible were removed from it by the building itself, folded away behind panels and down concealed steps, so that the splendour above could appear untouched by human effort. And within that hidden world, the servants built a hierarchy of their own, one as rigid as anything above stairs, and, in its way, more merciless. The world outside the palace had its classes, its ranks, its careful gradations. The world below stairs mirrored them and sharpened them. At the top stood the senior servants, the butler, the housekeeper, the chef, the queen's personal dressers. They held real power over hiring, discipline, and the daily order of the house. They had their own private rooms. They took their meals apart, served by juniors. They were, within the servants' world, a kind of aristocracy, and they guarded their standing as fiercely as any duke. Beneath them, the ranks descended, step by careful step, down to the scullery maids and the hall boys who occupied a servitude beneath servitude. A senior servant could command a junior as absolutely as any lord commanded a footman. The distinctions were fierce and jealously kept. Where a person sat at the servants' table, who spoke first, who was served first, who could give an order, and who could only take one, all of it was fixed by a code the servants enforced upon themselves. A young maid learned that she must defer to the housekeeper as completely as the housekeeper deferred to the queen. The servants policed the order of rank below stairs entirely themselves, each rank pressing down on the one beneath, and the palace never had to lift a finger to enforce it. The days that this order filled were long and hard. The lowest servants rose before dawn to light the fires and heat the water so that the house was warm and ready before the family stirred. They worked through the day at the endless tasks of a great house, the cleaning, the carrying, the fetching, the serving, and they finished only when the last need of the household had been met, often late into the night. The bells governed everything. A pull on a cord in a room above sent a bell ringing below stairs, and a servant answered it at once, appearing as if from nowhere, doing what was asked, and vanishing again. It was a life measured in summons and silence, in tasks that never ended, and a presence that was never to be felt. To live this way for years was to be shaped by it, body and manner, into a person who moved quietly, spoke little, and expected to be overlooked. And yet, for all its hardship, this world had its own pride and its own belonging. A servant in a great house was somebody among servants. She had a place, a rank, a role in a vast and ancient machine. The senior staff carried real authority and real dignity. Even the humblest maid could say she served the Queen of England, and in the world of the time that meant something. The bargain was cruel, but it carried real value, and the people who accepted it understood exactly what they were choosing. They were making the best of a narrow world, trading their visibility for a security that the streets outside could rarely offer. Over the women hung an additional rule that could end a career in a single day. It was very rare for servants to keep their posts if they married. The marriage bar meant that a housemaid or a dresser who chose a husband usually chose at the same moment to leave royal service. A woman might give her best years to the palace and then lose her place the day she claimed a life of her own. Service and marriage were treated as things that could not sit together, and for many women the choice was final. To love, to marry, to build a family, was to walk out of the palace gates for good. Consider what all of this asked of a person. To work at the palace was to accept, day after day, that you were essential and invisible at once. Your labor held the house together. Your presence was an offense to be hidden in a cupboard. You belonged to a hierarchy that could lift you to real authority or grind you at the bottom. And if you were a woman, the ordinary human wish to marry could cost you everything you had built. The palace offered security, prestige, a place inside the grandest walls in Britain. In return, it asked you to be trained out of being seen, to shrink yourself against a doorway at the sound of a footstep, to make of your own body a thing that could disappear. The reward for accepting all of that was, for most, only a wage, small and carefully weighed. And the wage, when you looked at it honestly beside the treasures those hands touched every day, revealed the hardest arithmetic in the whole hidden house. Chapter 5. 13 pounds and a length of cloth. At the very bottom of the palace stood a girl who scrubbed pots for 13 pounds a year. She was a scullery maid, the lowest rank in the kitchen, and her days were spent in grease, steam, and cold water, cleaning the pans and dishes that fed a household of hundreds. 13 pounds a year. That was her place in the great machine, measured in money. She rose before dawn to light the kitchen fires, and she worked until the last pot from the last meal was clean. Above her rose a pyramid of wages so steep that the people at its summit earned in a way she could scarcely imagine, though she worked under the same roof and served the same crown. The shape of that pyramid can be drawn precisely, and it should be understood as the general scale of Victorian service, applied to grand houses and the palace alike, rather than as an exact palace ledger for a single named year. A butler might earn 40 to 60 pounds a year. A lady's maid or a valet earned 20 to 30. A first footman earned around 30 pounds, with perhaps 5 to 15 more in tips. A second footman earned about 25, an ordinary footman about 20. A parlour maid earned about 20. A housemaid earned about 16. A kitchen maid earned about 15. And at the bottom, the scullery maid on her 13 pounds, and the page or tea boy on somewhere between 8 and 16. From the summit of the kitchen down to its floor, the distance was enormous, and it was measured in every basin scrubbed and every stair climbed. For the chief cook stood at the top of that same kitchen, and he was paid £250 a year. Set the two figures side by side, and the hidden world snaps into focus. The man who ran the kitchen earned nearly 20 times what the girl who scrubbed its pots earned, and both of them worked in the same rooms, over the same fires, for the same queen. The pyramid was brutally steep, a near vertical climb, and most who entered service at the bottom would never see the top. A scullery maid might rise in time to kitchen maid, and a kitchen maid might dream of becoming a cook, but the summit belonged to a different order of person, and everyone below stairs knew it. Yet the cash wage was only part of the true pay, and here the picture softens a little. Servants received allowances that made the life livable. There was beer, there was sugar, there was tea, given as a matter of course. There was an annual issue of cloth for uniforms, so that a servant did not have to buy the clothes the work required. Footmen were given 2 full sets of livery outright. These allowances, the board wages and perquisites of service, were real value on top of the coins, and the difference between a good place and a hard one often lay in how freely they were given. A servant fed, warmed, housed, and clothed by the household could save almost the whole of a small wage if the household was generous and the servant careful. A cautious maid might over years put by enough to matter. This was the quiet logic that drew people into service and kept them there. A wage of £16 a year sounds like almost nothing, and in the open world it would have been. But a housemaid did not pay for her room, her food, her fire, or the cloth of her uniform. Those were provided. Her wage, small as it was, could be saved almost whole, coin by coin, year by year, toward a dowry, a small nest of savings, or simply the security of knowing there was something set by. For a young woman from a poor family, a place at the palace meant a roof that would not fail, meals that would come, and a wage she could actually keep. Set against the hunger and uncertainty of the world beyond the gates, that was a powerful thing, and it explains why the palace never wanted for hands willing to disappear into its corridors. But hold the scullery maid's £13 in mind, and then look up at what her hands were near. She scrubbed pots in a building whose staterooms held paintings, gold plate, and treasures beyond any accounting. The palace was funded through the civil list, the parliamentary grant that paid for the running of the whole household, a public income rather than a private one. A single object in the rooms above her, a single painting, a single service of gold, could be worth many times her entire life's wages. She earned £13 a year in a house whose yearly upkeep would have paid her wage many thousands of times over. That was the arithmetic of invisible labour, and it was the truest measure of where she stood. The distance between the girl and the gold was the distance the whole palace was built to hide. The servants were under no illusion about this gap. They saw it every day. They carried the gold plate to the tables. They dusted the paintings in their frames. They polished the silver until they could see their own tired faces in it. They knew, better than anyone at the railings, the exact distance between the value of the things they touched and the value the palace placed on the hands that touched them. There was no illusion below stairs about what a scullery maid was worth to the house in pounds and pence. She was worth 13 a year, and she knew it, even as she cleaned the vessels that had held a monarch's dinner. And still they came, in their thousands across the century. They came because for a working person in Victorian Britain, service in the royal household was security, status, and a roof. And those were not small things in a hard age. Beyond the palace walls lay the factory, the workhouse, the uncertainty of casual labour, hunger that was never far away. Inside them lay a bed, a fire, 3 meals, and the pride of serving the Queen herself. It was a bargain that cost the servant dearly, but in the world of the time, it was a bargain many were glad to take. What they gave in return went beyond labour. It was appearance. The palace demanded more of its servants than clean rooms and cooked meals. On the great occasions, it needed them to become part of the spectacle itself, and no servant embodied that stranger demand more completely than the footman, chosen, dressed, and powdered to be looked at. Chapter 6. The men chosen for their calves. To be a footman at the palace, a man needed height, a straight back, and a good pair of legs. His skill mattered, but it came second to how he looked. He was hired, in large part, for the figure he cut. Footmen were chosen for their good looks and their stature, and the taller, the better. A great house liked to display its footmen in matched pairs, 2 tall men of similar height moving together, and a well-matched pair was a mark of status in itself, a piece of living decoration that announced the wealth of the household as loudly as any painting on the wall. A man might win his place at the palace less for what he could do than for the length of his legs and the breadth of his shoulders. The livery completed the effect. A footman was given 2 sets of it. One was the undress livery for ordinary duty, plainer and more practical. The other was the full dress livery for grand occasions, and it was a costume of real theatre. Black breeches, white stockings drawn to the knee, a red waistcoat, a coat of bright blue with epaulettes at the shoulder, white gloves for indoor work. Dressed in this, a footman was transformed from a working man into an ornament of the state, a figure whose very body advertised the grandeur of the house he served. The stockings drawn to the knee left the calf on display, which is why the shape of a man's leg could matter to his employment, and why some footmen padded their stockings to improve the line. Then there was the hair. In the older tradition that lingered longest in the grandest houses, a footman powdered his hair. The method was laborious. Soap and water were worked into a stiff lather and combed through the hair in even rows, and then powder was dusted over it. In the finer households, the powder was violet-scented. In the thriftier ones, it was ordinary flour from the kitchen, the same flour that thickened the sauces downstairs, now whitening the head of the man who carried them up. There is something strange and telling in that image, the same sack of flour feeding the family above and dressing the servant below. The look was striking. The upkeep was punishing. A powdered footman had to wash and oil his hair every single night to clear the residue before he could sleep, and do it all again the next day. Think of what that meant across a life of service. Every night, after a day that began at 6:30 or 7 in the morning, the footman scrubbed the caked powder from his scalp so that he could powder it again at dawn. His height, chosen for him at birth, had brought him the place. His hair, dusted with flour and washed raw each night, was part of the price. On the great days, he was paid to be a matched, powdered, blue-coated figure, as much a furnishing of the palace as the mirrors and the gilt, and the man inside it hardly mattered at all. His individuality was the one thing the livery was designed to erase, so that he and his partner could stand as a matched pair, identical, interchangeable, ornamental. And on those great days, the hidden workforce briefly became the visible one. When the palace held a state banquet or a court ball, the machinery below stairs rose up into the light. Hundreds of footmen, kitchen staff, and porters moved through the service corridors in a silent, practiced choreography, so that a single glittering evening could appear effortless to the guests. The footmen who lined the rooms in their blue and white were the flower of that hidden root system, the one moment when the labour of the house was meant to be seen, precisely because it had been made beautiful. Every dish that arrived at the perfect moment, every glass filled without a word, was the visible tip of an enormous, invisible effort reaching down into the basements. Behind that seamless surface lay hours of punishing endurance. A footman on duty at a great banquet stood for hour after hour, straight-backed and still, ready to move at a glance, forbidden to speak unless spoken to, forbidden to show fatigue or hunger or discomfort of any kind. The heat of hundreds of candles and the press of guests made the great rooms close and warm, and still the footmen held their places, silent and correct in their heavy livery. Downstairs, the kitchens roared. Cooks and maids worked at speed and at temperature, sending course after course up through the service passages in an exact order, on an exact schedule, so that the illusion of ease above was never broken. A single delay, a single dropped dish, a single footman out of step could shatter the spell the whole hidden workforce had been assembled to cast. The effortlessness the guests admired was the hardest kind of work there is, the work of making labour vanish. And when the last guest had gone, the illusion was folded away and the servants returned to their true place. The blue coats came off. The powder was washed from the hair. The great rooms were cleared, cleaned, and set right for the morning, often by the same exhausted people who had just spent the evening as living ornaments. By dawn, the palace would show no trace of the effort that had filled it, and the footmen who had stood like statues would be back at their ordinary work, invisible once more. There was a strange pride in it, and a strange cruelty too. To be a palace footman was to stand near the summit of the servant world, better paid than the maids, dressed in colours a labourer could never afford, part of the grandest occasions in the kingdom. A footman could feel himself a somebody, admired, envied, close to the great events of state. And yet the man inside the blue coat was still a servant, still bound by the law of invisibility on every ordinary day, still washing flour from his hair at midnight, still able to be dismissed at a quarter's notice. He was decoration that breathed. His beauty was rented by the house, and the house could return it whenever it chose. age, injury, or a single mistake could end the display, and the tall young man in blue would be replaced by another, just as tall, just as matched. The powder faded from fashion in the early years of the 20th century, one more piece of the old service world quietly abandoned. But in Victoria's palace, it was still worn, still dusted on, still washed off, night after night, by tall men chosen for their calves. They stood at the doors and behind the chairs, powdered and silent, the living furniture of the monarchy. Above them all, at the top of the kitchen that fed the whole household, stood a man whose story showed just how far and how fast even the mightiest servant could fall. Chapter 7. The Chef Who Insulted the Wrong Man. For 2 years, the finest kitchen in Britain answered to a young man with a French training and a dangerous temper. His name was Charles Elme Francatelli. He had been born in London in 1805, and he had trained in France under Antonin Carême, the most celebrated cook of the age, the man who had helped invent the very idea of the modern chef. To be trained by Carême was to carry the highest culinary pedigree in Europe. And in March of 1840, on the recommendation of the Earl of Errol, Francatelli was appointed to the summit of his profession. He became maître d'hôtel and chief cook in ordinary to Queen Victoria. His salary marked his rank. £250 a year, paid quarterly. In the pyramid of the palace kitchen, this was the peak, nearly 20 times the wage of the scullery maid who cleaned the pans beneath him. He commanded the great kitchens of the palace, the fires, the larders, the still rooms, the whole vast operation of feeding a royal household of hundreds. A chef in a modest private house might earn £30. Francatelli, the royal chef, earned enough to place him among the elite of all servants in the land. He had reached, at a young age, the very top of the world below stairs, a Londoner risen to cook for the Queen of England. To picture his domain is to picture an engine room of fire and steam. The palace kitchens fed the Queen and her family, and the enormous household that served them as well, meal after meal, day after day. Under Francatelli worked cooks, kitchen maids, and scullery maids, a small army of hands turning raw provisions into the food of a court. He stood at the head of it, the artist and the general both, responsible for everything that rose from the basements to the tables above. It was a position of real power, real pressure, and real pride. And Francatelli had the pride in full measure. The scale of the work below him was immense. A royal household of hundreds had to be fed every day, and the grandest occasions demanded feasts of many courses, each dish prepared to a standard that would satisfy the most exacting court in the world. Provisions arrived in enormous quantities and were stored, prepared, and cooked in the basement kitchens and the larders and still rooms around them. The heat of the fires, the noise, the pressure of the hours, all of it fell on the people below stairs, and all of it answered, in the end, to the chief cook. To command such a kitchen was to hold one of the great positions of the servant world, and Francatelli, trained by the finest cook in Europe, had climbed to the very top of it while still a young man, and within 2 years he had thrown it all away. The senior servant's power, for all its salary and status, rested on a single fragile thing, the favour of the household above him. Francatelli had the temper of an artist and the pride to match, and on the 30th of November 1841, that pride undid him. He insulted the deputy comptroller, a man named Norton, and he did it in the worst possible way, in front of the pages and about 40 other people. It was a public humiliation of a superior, witnessed by dozens, and in the rigid world of the palace, it could not be overlooked. To shame a superior openly before the assembled staff was to strike at the whole order of the house. The response was swift. Francatelli was suspended and given a quarter's notice. On the 31st of March, 1842, he left the palace and returned to Crockford's, the famous gaming club whose kitchens he had run before. His royal appointment, the crown of his career, had lasted barely 2 years, and it had ended through a single loss of temper before the wrong audience, while his cooking had never once been in question. The greatest kitchen in Britain had answered to him, and then, in an afternoon, it did not. The pedigree of Carême, the salary of £250, the command of the royal kitchens, all of it counted for nothing against one intemperate outburst. His story is the sharpest possible lesson in the fragility of the mighty servant. A scullery maid on £13 could be dismissed, yes, but she had little to lose and expected little. Francatelli had everything the below-stairs world could offer: the pedigree, the salary, the command, the royal name attached to his own. And all of it hung on the goodwill of the people he served. When he forgot that, when he spoke to a superior as an equal or a lesser, the whole structure that had raised him simply let him drop. The higher a servant climbed, the further there was to fall, and the fall could come in a single sentence spoken in anger. Rank below stairs was only ever alone, and the house could call it in whenever it chose. Francatelli went on to write cookery books that outlived him, including a famous guide to cooking for the working classes, and he died in 1876. But he never again cooked for the Queen. His 2 years at the summit of the palace kitchen stand as a warning carved into the story of the house. Below stairs, power was always lent, never owned. The house could raise a man from a London kitchen to the right hand of the crown, and the house could send him back, and it owed him no explanation beyond a quarter's notice. That was the palace, as its servants knew it in the middle of the century, ordered at last, rigidly ranked, beautiful on its great days, and merciless underneath. But the hidden world had another secret, one that had nothing to do with wages or livery or the temper of a chef. It was a secret about how porous that hidden world truly was, and it arrived in the unlikely shape of a teenage boy who walked into the palace again and again and made himself at home. Chapter 8. The Boy Who Lived in the Walls. For 3 years, a teenage intruder came and went inside Buckingham Palace almost as freely as the staff who worked there. His name was Edward Jones, and he was an apothecary's errand boy from a poor London family. He was 14 years old when he first got in, and what he did over the next 3 years exposed the hidden palace more completely than any memoir ever could. The house that ordered its own servants to vanish could not keep out a determined boy from the streets, and his story became one of the strangest scandals the palace has ever known. The first intrusion came in December of 1838. Jones was found inside the palace in the small hours of the morning by a night porter. He was smeared in soot and grease, as though he had come down a chimney, and he was carrying an extraordinary haul. He had a regimental sword that belonged to the master of the household himself. He had several pairs of trousers. He had foreign coins, inkstands, a stand for wafers, linen, and, most strangely of all, a portrait of the Queen and some items of underwear. He had, in short, wandered the private palace at will and helped himself to whatever caught his eye. The Queen was away at Windsor at the time. Jones was put on trial, and at the end of December 1838, he was acquitted and set loose. He came back. In the winter of 1840, he scaled the wall on Constitution Hill and climbed in through a window. This time the timing was alarming. It was only days after Victoria had given birth to her first child, the Princess Royal, and Jones was found hiding under a sofa in a room close to the Queen's own bedroom. A page detected him and secured him. He had taken nothing and carried no weapon. He had simply got inside, again, and concealed himself in the most private heart of the house, feet from a sleeping monarch and her newborn child. For this, he was sentenced to 3 months of hard labour, and the palace no doubt believed it had seen the last of him. 3 months later, he was back a third time. In March of 1841, within a fortnight of his release, Jones was discovered in the palace once more, in the dead of night, near the picture gallery. This time he was eating. He had cold meat and potatoes that he had carried up from the palace kitchens in a white handkerchief. Picture the scene the servants faced. The kitchens they ran, the food they prepared for a royal household, had been raided by a boy who then settled somewhere in the great gallery and made himself a midnight supper of the leftovers. The same footmen and porters and kitchen staff, whose whole existence was ordered around the security and secrecy of the house, had been outwitted, once again, by a child. He was sentenced to another 3 months of hard labour. Each intrusion cut deeper than the last, because each one reached further into the private heart of the house. The first time, he was a thief in the outer rooms, laden with stolen goods. The second time, he was a shadow beneath a sofa a few feet from the sleeping queen and her newborn daughter at the most vulnerable moment of her life. The third time, he was a guest who had invited himself to supper, moving through the palace at night as if he owned it, eating the food the servants had prepared. The pattern was unmistakable and deeply unsettling. A ragged boy from the streets could enter the most guarded house in the realm again and again, and the great machinery of servants and porters and locks could not keep him out. London delighted in him. A pun ran through society that this persistent boy must be a descendant of Inigo Jones, the great architect, and so he was nicknamed In I Go Jones, the boy who kept going in. The joke was recorded by a diarist in the spring of 1841, and the newspapers followed his adventures with glee. But behind the joke was a genuine scandal of the hidden palace. The servants and porters whose task was to guard the house had been made to look helpless by a boy off the street. If the great below-stairs machine could not keep out one ragged intruder, what did that say about the fortress the public imagined the palace to be? Jones himself later boasted of what he had seen inside, claiming he had sat upon the throne and heard the infant princess cry. That claim was his own, never confirmed by any witness, and it should be treated as the brag of a strange, attention-hungry boy, rather than as established fact. What is documented is remarkable enough. He got in 3 times. He hid under a royal sofa. He ate from the royal kitchen. He lived for hours inside the walls the palace believed were sealed, and for a time, no one could stop him. The authorities finally solved the problem by turning to the sea. To be rid of him quietly, they had Jones sent aboard a warship as a ship's boy in 1842, removing him from London and from the palace for good. His later life wandered through the Navy and, eventually, transportation to the far side of the world, where he died many years afterward in Australia. But his 3 years of intrusion left a lasting mark on the story of the house. For the servants, the boy Jones was a mirror held up to their world. Every day, they were told to be invisible, to keep to the back stairs, to guard the boundary between the hidden palace and the royal one. And here was a boy who crossed that boundary at will, slept under the Queen's sofa, and ate from the Queen's kitchen. If a child could vanish into the palace so completely, then the palace was never the sealed fortress it pretended to be, only a vast, porous, half-secret place, held together less by walls than by the constant labour of people watching, guarding, and cleaning. And some of those people held secrets far heavier than a stolen supper. Chapter 9. the dresser who kept her word. A German seamstress spent 5 years close enough to the Queen to know her secrets, and she took them to her grave. Her name was Frida Arnold, and she came to the palace in 1854 to serve as a dresser to Queen Victoria. The post placed her among the most intimate servants in the entire household. A dresser helped the Queen prepare and wardrobe, moved through her private rooms, and stood daily in the closest presence a servant could occupy. To hold such a place was to be trusted with the small, unguarded truths of a monarch's life, and that trust was the whole of the job. A careless dresser, or a talkative one, was worse than useless. She was a danger to the crown itself. Arnold served until 1859, and what makes her rare is that she wrote. Her letters home, sent to her family in Germany, survived, and long after her death they were gathered and published, giving history one of its few genuine voices from below stairs in the royal palace. In them, she described the world the servants actually lived in. She wrote of the soot and the cold of London, the grime that settled over everything, the daily routines of a court seen from the inside rather than the throne. Through her eyes, the palace appears as a working house, dirty and demanding, kept alight by people like her, a world away from the pure splendor the public imagined. Her letters are a window that almost no other servant left open, a rare crack in the wall of silence the palace built around itself. But the most telling thing about Frida Arnold is what she chose to withhold. She was placed to know intimate matters of the royal family. She understood the German that the family spoke together at home, which meant that private conversations, not meant for servants' ears, were open to her. She could have recorded them. She could, in later life, have sold them for a fortune. And she did not. She kept her promise never to reveal the private life of the royal family. The code of silence that bound the trusted servant, she honoured to the end. She saw, and she stayed silent, and that silence was understood by everyone below stairs as the price of the place. Discretion was the currency of the intimate servant, and Arnold spent it faithfully all her life. Above her in the wardrobe stood a woman who embodied that same discretion across a far longer span. Marianne Skerritt was Victoria's principal dresser, and she served from the very start of the reign in 1837 until 1862, 25 years at the Queen's side. Skerritt was far more than a dresser, a trusted intermediary between the Queen and the artists and tradesmen who served the court, dealing with painters, including the celebrated Edwin Landseer on the Queen's behalf. A senior servant of this kind held real influence precisely because she could be trusted absolutely. Nothing she saw was ever repeated. Nothing she was told ever escaped. Skerritt lived to the great age of 94, a quarter-century of her working life given to the invisible service of one woman, and her reward was the Queen's trust and little else the world would ever record. The value the palace placed on this silence can be measured by what happened when it broke. Late in Victoria's reign, in 1897, a book appeared under the title of The Private Life of the Queen, published anonymously by a writer described only as a member of the royal household. It claimed to describe the Queen's daily domestic life, the ordinary, intimate truths that servants alone could know. The reaction at court was fury. The book gave offence, and it was reportedly suppressed and bought up, an early warning of how dangerous a talking servant could be. Set that book beside Frida Arnold's letters, and the difference is everything. Arnold saw as much as any anonymous author and said nothing in her lifetime that could wound the family. The unknown writer of 1897 broke the code, and the household moved at once to silence the book. Below stairs, silence was a rule the palace was prepared to enforce. The lives of Arnold and Skerritt reveal the strange bargain at the heart of the senior servant's world. Intimacy was the reward and the trap at once. The closer a servant stood to the crown, the more she knew. And the more she knew, the more absolute her silence had to be. The very servants who understood the royal family best were the ones bound most tightly to say nothing, to carry what they saw to the grave, to be present at the most private moments of a monarch's life, and then to disappear from the record entirely. They were the keepers of secrets, who were themselves kept secret, valuable precisely because they could be forgotten. Over the women who served in these roles hung, as ever, the marriage bar. Frida Arnold's own service ended when she married. She left the palace to become the wife of a photographer named Ernst Müller, and with that marriage, her years at court were over. It was the ordinary pattern. A woman gave her closest, most trusted years to the Queen, and the moment she chose a husband and a life of her own, the palace released her. The intimacy that had made her valuable gave her no exemption from the rule. She had stood at the very centre of the household, and she walked out of it into ordinary life the day she chose to marry. So the trusted servant carried a double weight. She bore the secrets of the house, and she bore the knowledge that her place could end with her own wish to marry. She was essential and expendable in the same breath, holding a monarch's private life in her hands while holding no security for her own. And when her service finally ended, whether by marriage or by age, what did the palace give in return for a life of loyalty and silence? For the longest serving of all, the answer was strikingly small and strikingly telling. Chapter 10. A silver teapot for a lifetime. After decades of service, the reward for a life spent invisible was a silver teapot and a medal. That was the literal record of what the palace gave to some of its most devoted servants, and it says more about the hidden world than any wage table ever could. Take the case of Eliza Jane Thornton. She was the housekeeper, one of the most senior women below stairs, and she served from 1855 until 1893, nearly 40 years. She had transferred from Windsor to Buckingham Palace, and she ran the female staff, supervised the housemaids, managed the storerooms, and upheld the standards of the whole domestic operation. For all of that, across all those years, the tokens of the Queen's thanks were a silver sugar basin, given in 1856 and valued at £15, and a silver teapot, given in 1859. Hold that teapot in your mind, because it is the truest emblem of this whole story. Nearly 40 years of a woman's working life, spent keeping the whole vast palace in order, distilled into a small piece of silver. It was a genuine mark of favour, and Thornton no doubt treasured it as such. But set beside the scale of what she gave, it measures exactly how the palace valued even its most loyal hands. A palace remembers its kings. It forgets the hands that kept it standing. Eliza Jane Thornton held the whole house in order for 4 decades, and history remembers her chiefly through a teapot and a sugar basin worth £15. The pattern of the lifelong servant repeats across the household, and nowhere more strikingly than in the Royal Mews. There a man named William Whaley served as an outrider and postilion, one of the riders who managed the horses that drew the royal carriages. Whaley began his work as a boy of 13 in 1840. He served the crown until 1926. That is a connection to the royal household, stretching across the better part of a century, from a child in Victoria's earliest years to an old man in the reign of her great-grandson. In 1886, after 33 years of service, he was awarded the Queen's Faithful Service Medal. The medal, the teapot, the sugar basin. These were the rewards of a life given whole to the house. The Royal Mews, where Whaley spent his years, was a world in itself, and its numbers show the scale of the hidden establishment. In the middle of the century, the Mews held roughly 200 staff and family members living on the site. There were about 50 weekly helpers, 20 grooms and 12 coachmen. The state coachman kept some 25 saddle horses, trained to stay calm through the noise of ceremony, the bands and the crowds and the waving banners. Victoria even established a school there in 1855 for the children of the Mews workers, a small community raised inside the machinery of the monarchy. Whole families lived and died in the service of the royal horses, generation folded into generation, mostly nameless to the world beyond the gates. That little school says something gentle and something hard at once. It was a real kindness, a place for the children of grooms and coachmen to learn their letters, and the records note that they passed their examinations creditably. But it also shows how complete the world of service could be. A child born in the royal mews might grow up there, learn there, and step straight into the same service his father had given, never really leaving the walls of the household at all. For families like these, the palace was an entire world in itself, a closed community with its own school, its own hierarchy, its own rhythm of duty, sealed off from the city outside. To be born into royal service was, very often, to die in it. This is the deepest form of the hidden life, the one that lasted generations. A boy learned the horses because his father knew the horses. A girl entered the still room because her mother had a place in the household. The palace absorbed whole bloodlines into its service, and it returned to them a livelihood, a roof, and a belonging that was real, if narrow. But it also bound them. A family folded into royal service could find that the world beyond the gates had grown strange and distant, that the only life they knew was the one lived in the corridors and yards of the great house. They were cared for, and they were captured at once, held inside the machinery of the monarchy by the very security it offered them. This was the true human cost of the palace, paid across the slow spending of entire lives rather than in any single dramatic moment. A girl entered service young. She rose, if she was able and lucky, through the ranks. She gave the palace her strength, her years, her discretion, and often her chance at a family of her own, because to marry was usually to leave. And at the end, if she had served long and served well, she might receive a piece of silver and a medal, and a place in a record that history would rarely open. The reward for a lifetime invisible was to remain, at the last, invisible. There is something almost unbearable in the arithmetic of it. 40 years for a teapot, 86 years of connection to the household for a medal. And yet, in the values of the age, these counted as honours, and the people who received them felt them as such. That is the deepest strangeness of the below-stairs world. It asked everything. It gave little. And the people inside it often gave everything gladly, because service in so great a house was, for a working person of that century, a life of meaning and security that the world outside could rarely match. The tragedy lay in devotion itself. The system was built so that loyalty cost the servant dearly and returned so little, and the servant loved the house all the same. That system had endured, in its essential shape, for the better part of a century. It would take something new, something the reformers and the wars had not yet brought, to begin to empty the servants' hall at last. And when the change came, it came as a quiet hum in the walls rather than a crash. Chapter 11. The wires that ended the work. The thing that finally began to empty the servants' hall came quietly, in the form of a wire. For all the reforms of Prince Albert, all the rigid hierarchy, all the lifetimes spent tending fires and trimming lamps, the below-stairs world had survived essentially unchanged in its logic. It ran on hands. It needed a great army of people because everything the palace did, it did by human labour. Light, warmth, the carrying and cleaning and fetching, All of it was work done by people, and so the palace needed people in their hundreds. Then, slowly, the machines arrived, and each one quietly abolished a task that had once required a servant. Electricity came early to Buckingham Palace. The ballroom was the first room to be lit by it, as far back as 1883, in the reign of Victoria herself. It seemed at first a marvel and a luxury, a brighter and cleaner light for the grandest occasions. But every electric lamp that replaced an oil lamp or a candle was a small deletion of labour. A lamp that switched on did not need a servant to fill it, to trim its wick, to carry it from room to room, and to clean away the soot it left behind. The work that whole categories of servants had existed to perform simply began to disappear into the wiring of the walls. The hum of electricity was, though no one yet named it so, the sound of the hidden workforce being made, room by room, unnecessary. Think of the labour that a single candle-lit palace had once demanded. Hundreds of lamps and candles, each one filled, lit, watched, snuffed, and cleaned. Fires in countless grates, each one laid, lit, fed with coal, carried up from the cellars, and cleared of ash the next morning. An entire rhythm of human effort existed only to hold back the dark and the cold. Electric light and, in time, modern heating did that work without a single pair of hands. The servant who had spent her mornings clearing grates and her evenings tending lamps found slowly that the house no longer needed the task she was there to do. When Victoria died and her son came to the throne as Edward VII in 1901, the palace entered a new age, and the change ran in two directions at once. On the surface, the household grew grander. Edward loved ceremony, and his household expanded significantly after his accession, reflecting the greatly increased ceremonial and administrative duties of his reign. His wife, Queen Alexandra, was given her own separate household as queen. The court came alive again, with dinners and balls and levees after the long seclusion of Victoria's widowhood, and the palace once more became a working stage of state. In that sense, the number of people attached to the household swelled, and the great occasions blazed as brightly as ever. But beneath the ceremony, the old working machine was being modernized out of existence. The palace was fitted with the technologies of the new century, and each one erased a little more of the labor that had defined the below-stairs world. The vast effort once needed simply to light and heat the house shrank as wires and pipes did the work that hands had always done. The great army of lamp tenders and fire tenders and carriers that a candle and coal palace demanded was no longer needed in the same numbers. The grandest occasions still called for their footmen and their kitchens, but the daily, invisible labour of keeping a huge house merely alight and warm was passing to the machines. This was the first true sign that the hidden world was mortal. For centuries, the logic had seemed permanent. A great house needed a great staff. It was as fixed as the seasons. Electricity broke that logic. It proved that the labour was not, after all, eternal, that a task performed by 100 hands for 100 years could be done instead by a switch. And once that was proved for light, it would be proved for heat, for laundry, for a dozen kinds of work, each machine quietly retiring another rank of servant into history. The people who had built their whole identity around invisible service could not yet see the full shape of what was coming. There is a deep irony buried in this change. For centuries, the servants had been told, in effect, that they were essential, that the great house could not function without their hands, that their labour was the very thing that held the world of the palace together. And it was true, until suddenly it was not. The machines proved that the indispensable could be dispensed with, that the work a person had given a lifetime to could be done by a mechanism in the wall. The grooms and lamp tenders and fire tenders, who had believed their skills would always be needed, were watching the ground shift beneath them, slowly, quietly, without a single announcement. The end came without any announcement at all, one abolished task at a time, while the servants worked on in the belief that their skills would always be wanted. Under George V and Queen Mary, the household continued through the early decades of the new century, still grand, still large, still bound by the old rules of service. But the course was set. Each new comfort of the modern age was one less reason to keep a servant, and the great establishment that Victoria and Albert had ordered and perfected was beginning, almost imperceptibly, to shrink. The servants' hall still filled at mealtimes. The livery was still worn, yet the age that had needed such a vast, unseen workforce was passing, and everyone who lived long enough would see it go. The Edwardian palace still glittered. The footmen still stood in their livery. The kitchens still sent up their dinners. But the age that had needed them in their hundreds was ending, slowly and without a single dramatic fall, in a quiet, humming withdrawal of the very need for their labour. The servants' hall emptied without a siege, quietly, gently, and irreversibly made obsolete. And then, into that slow fading, came the century's great violence. The wars emptied the palace under fire, with none of the quiet of the electric light, and they turned the hidden workforce for a few terrible years into people who held the grandest house in Britain together, while the bombs came down upon it. Chapter 12. The Palace Under Fire. In 2 world wars, the hidden workforce carried the palace through while bombs fell on the rooms they cleaned. The century that had begun to make the servants obsolete now asked them to endure the worst violence in the building's history, and they did. The Palace of Gold and Ceremony became, for a time, a house at war, and the people below stairs carried it through, as they had carried it through everything else, out of sight and largely out of memory. The First War brought austerity rather than destruction. When the fighting began, King George V chose to make the palace an example. He imposed rationing on his own household. He locked the wine cellars, and he himself went teetotal for the duration of the war, giving up alcohol entirely so that no one could say the king lived in luxury while his people went without. Meanwhile, much of the male staff left the palace for the forces, as young footmen and grooms and hall boys traded their livery for uniform and marched away to the front. The great household thinned, its men drawn off to the trenches, its comforts deliberately cut in the name of shared sacrifice. Many of those who left the servants' hall for the war would never come back to their places in it. There is something telling in the king's gesture of austerity. George V locked away his own wine and gave up his own drink, and the point of it was to be seen to share, in some small way, the hardship of his people. But the deeper sharing was invisible, as always. It was the young footmen and grooms and hall boys, drawn from ordinary families, who left the safety of the palace for the uniform and the front. The war drew the servants of the great house away into the same danger as the servants of every other house in the land. Below stairs, the palace shared in the trial of the nation directly, in the persons of the young men who marched away to fight. The Second War brought the bombs. Buckingham Palace was struck 9 times. The attacks were not glancing. The first hit came in September of 1940. Days later, on the 13th of September 1940, came the most serious raid of all. 5 high-explosive bombs struck the palace, while King George VI and Queen Elizabeth were actually inside. The bombs destroyed the royal chapel and shattered windows across the building. 4 palace workmen were injured in the blast, and one of them later died of his wounds. These were the true casualties of the hidden workforce, the men who were on the spot, doing the work of the house when the bombs found it. The following spring, in March of 1941, a policeman was killed when a bomb struck the North Lodge. Set the numbers side by side, and the danger is plain. 9 separate bombings of a single house. 5 bombs in one raid. A royal chapel destroyed. Windows blown across the building. 1 workman dead. Another death at the gate. And more injured besides. The people who kept the palace working were dying to do it. And still the work went on. Out of that ordeal came the Queen's famous words that she was glad the palace had been bombed because it made her feel she could look the East End in the face. The bombing had made the palace, for once, share the fate of the poorest streets in London. And the servants and workmen shared it most directly of all, since they were the ones who stayed to clear the glass and carry on. Even the private comforts of the house bent to the war. To enforce the rationing of water, black lines were painted inside the royal baths, so that no one, not even the king and queen, could exceed the allotted 5 inches of hot water. The image is almost unbearably ordinary. The grandest bathrooms in Britain marked with a stripe of paint to shame anyone who took too much. Rationing outlasted the fighting. When Princess Elizabeth married in 1947, she gathered clothing ration coupons for her wedding dress, the future queen subject to the same rules as any bride in the land. Through all of it, the work of the house went on. Someone had to clear the shattered glass after each raid. Someone had to keep the fires lit, the meals cooked, the rooms usable, in a building that was being bombed again and again. The staff that remained, thinned by the call-up and worn by the danger, carried the palace through the worst years it had ever known. They did it, as they had always done everything, out of sight and largely without thanks, their names absent from the histories of the war, even as they held the grandest house in the country together amid the fire. When the story of the palace in wartime is told, it is told through the king and queen who stayed in London and the bombs that fell around them. The people who swept up afterward, who cooked in the damaged kitchens, who died on the 13th of September, are a footnote at most, if they appear at all. During the war years, the palace had lost much of its staff to the army, and the old below-stairs establishment, already thinned by the electric age, never returned to its former scale. The war had done in a few violent years what the machines had begun to do slowly. It had shown that the great household could be cut to a fraction, and the house would still, somehow, stand. The hidden workforce had kept the palace alive under fire, and their reward, like the reward of every generation of servants before them, was to fade quietly from the story once the danger passed. And fade they did, more completely than ever, as the century wore on. Chapter 13. The long fade of the servants' hall. The great below-stairs world faded rather than fell, thinning slowly across the decades until almost no one was left. It faded quietly, with none of the auctions, demolitions, or dramatic falls that ended so many great country houses. The palace was the crown, and the crown endured. Yet the vast hidden settlement that had once filled its basements and attics drained away across the decades, worn down by the machines, the wars, and above all, by the death of domestic service as a way of life. The change was driven by the wider world as much as by the palace itself. Across the 20th century, fewer and fewer men and women were willing to give their lives to invisible service. The factories, the shops, the offices offered better hours, better freedom, and a life that did not require a person to hide in a cupboard at the approach of a superior. The old bargain, security and prestige, in exchange for total submission and near invisibility, made less and less sense to each new generation. The supply of willing servants, once seemingly endless, began to dry up, and the palace, like every great house in the land, had to make do with fewer hands and more machines. Yet the steep old hierarchy survived, in modern form, and it can still cause a scandal. In May of 2022, the palace advertised a post for a live-in housekeeper at a rate of £7.97 an hour. That was £1.53 below the national minimum wage. The base salary was stated as £19,900, adjusted downward for the value of the accommodation provided. When the figure drew public anger, the palace said the hourly rate had been published in error. The union Unite Hospitality was not soothed. It called the pay obscene for one of the richest landowners in the country. Nearly 2 centuries after the scullery maid earned her £13 a year, the person who cleaned the palace was again making headlines for how little the work paid. At the other end of that same modern hierarchy, the numbers tell the old story of distance. Senior posts in the royal household, the private secretary, the keeper of the privy purse, command salaries well into 6 figures. The person at the top of palace service and the person at the bottom are separated by a gulf that has narrowed in absolute terms since Victoria's day, but has kept its essential shape. There is still a summit, and there is still a floor, and the climb between them is still nearly vertical. Francatelli's £250 beside the scullery maid's 13 has become a modern 6-figure salary beside a wage near the legal minimum. The figures have changed. The shape has held. The palace itself still runs on a large staff. It remains the workplace of more than 800 people, and in recent years, a great programme of resurfacing has had to renew the ageing pipes and wires and service areas that the hidden workforce once tended by hand. The physical evidence of the old below-stairs world is still there in the fabric of the building, in the 188 staff bedrooms, in the miles of service corridor, in the basement kitchens. But the world that filled those spaces, the powdered footmen, the scullery maids, the lifelong housekeepers with their silver teapots, has passed into memory. The change is one of kind as much as of number. The servant of Victoria's day was meant to give a whole life, to live in, to stay silent, to disappear into the fabric of the house and remain there until age or marriage removed her. The staff of the modern palace are employees in the way the wider world understands the word, with contracts, with hours, with lives of their own beyond the gates. The total is still large, but the old idea of the servant, the person swallowed whole by the house and defined entirely by service to it, has faded almost completely. What remains is work and pay and a famous address on a wage slip. What has gone is the vanished life, the person trained from youth to be invisible and to want nothing more, and the palace guarded its silence to the last. The story of what happened to the servants who spoke is a story of punishment. As early as 1897, a book called The Private Life of the Queen appeared anonymously, written by someone described only as a member of the royal household, and it gave such offence that it was reportedly suppressed and bought up. In 1950, Marion Crawford, the governess the royal family had known affectionately as Crawfie, published her memoir of the Little Princesses and was cast out of royal favour for the rest of her life, ostracised completely for telling gentle tales out of school. A footman named David Payne, who served around the end of the 1950s, wrote a memoir that royal lawyers moved to injunct, a book the family had banned in Britain. The message across 60 years was consistent and clear. A servant who spoke, even kindly, even long after, would be silenced or shut out. What survives then, besides the corridors and the low wages, is the written memory of the very few who broke the silence and paid for it. and the letters of a dresser like Frida Arnold, published only long after her death, revealing nothing that could wound the living, preserving a voice from below stairs that would otherwise have vanished entirely. Almost everyone else kept the bargain. They served, and they stayed silent, and they disappeared. The servants' hall did not fall so much as empty, quietly, until the hidden army that had once kept the great house running had shrunk to a memory in the walls. And what that memory finally reveals, when you stand back and look at the whole of it, is the truest and hardest lesson the palace has to teach. Chapter 14. The people history tried to forget. A palace remembers its kings, and it forgets the hands that kept it standing. That line has run through this whole story, and now it must be paid in full, because it is the deepest truth of the most famous house on earth. Buckingham Palace was, in truth, a settlement of working people as much as a royal residence, hundreds of them living a parallel life inside the same walls, in attics and basements, along back stairs the public never saw, keeping the fires lit and the silver polished and the great machine of monarchy turning, on wages a fraction of the value of a single object in the rooms they cleaned. Think of what their service asked and what it gave. It asked a scullery maid to scrub pots for £13 a year beneath rooms holding treasures beyond counting. It asked a footman to be chosen for his height, dressed in blue and white, and to wash flour from his hair every night. It asked a dresser to carry a queen's secrets to her grave and to give up her place the day she married. It asked a housekeeper to give 40 years and a coachman to give the better part of a century. And it gave back, to the most loyal of them, a silver teapot, a medal, a place in a record that history would rarely open. The reward for a lifetime spent invisible was to remain invisible. The grandeur the world admires was manufactured every day by people trained to disappear. The rule that governed them was captured in a single stark description that survives from the household itself, that a servant was expected to leap into a cupboard if she heard Her Majesty coming. There it is, the whole bargain in one image. The people who made the palace beautiful were required, at the mere approach of the person they served, to hide themselves away. Their labour was the true engine of the house. Their reward was erasure. And when they spoke, when a servant broke the silence in later years, they were punished or shut out for it. When they died, keeping the palace alive under the bombs, they died almost anonymously, their names known to few and remembered by fewer. What the story finally reveals is the cost of permanence. A palace endures for centuries. Monarchs are remembered by name, carved into the record, their portraits hung on the very walls the servants dusted. And that endurance is built on the erased lives of the many. The gold and the balcony are what history chose to keep. The hidden workforce, living and dying in the corridors behind the state rooms, is what history tried to forget. Every gleaming surface, every warm room, every effortless banquet was the visible flower of an invisible labour, and the people who performed it were written out of the very grandeur they created. They gave the house its beauty and received in exchange their own disappearance. There is a lesson in this that reaches far beyond one palace. Every great and lasting thing in the world, every monument, every institution, every empire, is held up by the hidden labour of the forgotten. The pyramids had their builders, the cathedrals had their masons, and the palace had its scullery maids and footmen and housekeepers, the people whose work made permanence possible and whose names permanence did not bother to keep. Buckingham Palace is only the grandest and most visible example of a truth that runs through all of history. What endures is remembered. What made the endurance possible is not. the teapot given to Eliza Jane Thornton, the medal pinned on William Whaley, the silver sugar basin worth £15. These were the whole reward that the machinery of permanence offered to the human beings who kept it turning. And yet there is dignity in them still, in these forgotten people, precisely because they were not fooled and did not stop. The scullery maid knew what her £13 meant beneath the gold, and she scrubbed the pots anyway. The footman knew he was decoration, and he stood straight anyway. The dresser knew her secrets would earn her nothing, and she kept them anyway. The housekeeper gave 40 years for a piece of silver, and she gave them fully. They understood the bargain, hard as it was, and they honoured it with their labour and their loyalty, generation after generation, in the cold corridors behind the warm rooms. The grandeur was theirs as much as any monarch's, because without them there would have been no grandeur at all. So look again at the palace you thought you knew. Most people who see Buckingham Palace see the balcony, the gold, the changing of the guard. They see a house built for kings and queens. But now you have seen the other palace, the one below the marble, the settlement of the forgotten that kept it all alive. Behind every image of that famous facade stand the ghosts of the people who cleaned it, cooked in it, guarded it, and vanished from it. To look at Buckingham Palace and see only the monarchy is to see only half the building. The other half, the true engine, was always below stairs, in the cold corridors and the basement kitchens, in the hands that history tried and failed to erase completely. The next time the balcony fills and the gold catches the light and the world looks up in admiration, remember the corridors behind it and the hidden army that made the most famous house on earth possible. If this story of the hidden palace moved you, subscribe, because more forgotten worlds behind Britain's grandest houses are waiting here. And tell me in the comments, when you next see Buckingham Palace, will you think of the kings and queens, or of the people history trained to disappear? I would love to know what you decide.